back into time a few hundred years or so back and take a look at some of the people and the places and the architecture in our little town of Frankfort. We got folks from Owen County, from Georgia, from New York, from here in Frankfort on our little trip for tonight. Most asked question that we have is, how did Frankfort get its name? There is no fort, so to speak, in our town. That comes later. We have to go back to 1780. You have to see a different world than you see today. The city of Frankfort was not here. This was a place full of entanglements, of vines, infested with mosquitoes. It was a real mess. The river would often kind of come up onto the ground and create these boggy, swampy-like atmosphere. Worthless piece of land in this immediate area. Nobody wanted it. But to get from Lexington to Louisville, you had to cross the Kentucky River. And one of the most narrowest points and easiest to cross was right down here. But all the settlers would utilize that way to go to and from Lexington and Louisville. The Indians also knew this too. So they would often lie in wait and would ambush. In this particular instance, in 1780, they caught a couple of settlers there, shot one of them, killed him. His name was Stephen Franks. And from that time forward, it was called Frank's Ford. And they referred to this area as Frank's Ford. We're going to cross the river at Frank's Ford. Well, now, if you know the spelling of our town, it's Frankfort, F-O-R-T. To the south of us, about 60 miles, is a little town called Stanford, Kentucky. And it was named for a fort that withstood the Indian attacks, Standing Fort. But they're called Stanford, named for a fort, and we're called Frankfort, named for a ford. Don't ask me how these things come about. A lot of people like to know too is, how did Kentucky become the capital of this state? How did Frankfort, Kentucky become the capital? Because you have towns like Lexington and Louisville. Right up the road about a mile was Leestown. It also wanted to be the capital. Over in Woodford County, Petersburg, and another little burg called Nonesuch. We could have been in Nonesuch tonight instead of in Frankfort. But it turned out to be, we got to be the capital the good old American way. We bought it. $3,000, along with building materials. This huge square that you see here was donated for land so that they could build their Capitol building. They donated an old log cabin that James Wilkinson had built to let the legislature and the governor use until they could get one of these capitals built. So that's how we got it. A guy by the name of Andrew Holmes, he went around and collected the money from the merchants in 1792, and he made a bid, and they liked it because of the $3,000, I'm sure. Now this beautiful structure you see in front of you is our third Capitol building. This was built about 1827. The first two buildings would burn. This was built by a man from Lexington, Kentucky. Gideon Schrock was his name. He was only 24 years old. This is his masterpiece and his claim to fame. He has other buildings that he's built in Lexington at Transylvania, Old Morrison Hall. Over in Louisville, the Jefferson County Courthouse. Some more buildings here in Frankfort, and one other that we'll mention a little later on. This building, the columns are 33 feet tall, 4 feet wide. The blocks of marble that you see there, limestone, is called Birdseye limestone. It has little black flecks in it, and that's where it gets its name. It was quarried from the Kentucky River, and it was put together here in about 1827 and finished around 1830 or so. And this was our seat of government until 1910, when we were so big that we decided we better build a new structure, and over in South Frankfort is the present Capitol building that replaced this one. It was sort of dormant for a few years. The Kentucky Historical Society took it over, and now the rest is history. It was from this window over here in this corner building that a bullet was shot and killed Governor William Goebel. William Goebel was shot on January the 30th and fell right here on this particular spot. He and a couple of his friends were on the way over to the legislature here. He was not governor at the time he was shot. it was one of those battles between the Democrats and the Republicans. We've been having those battles ever since, but thank goodness we don't resort to that sort of effort. The Republicans had won the election. If you will, let's come this way. They had won the election. Democrats weren't pleased with it. There was an election law called the Goebel election law that really set up in the counties of Kentucky the Democrats to count the ballots, a special committee. And so they could actually steal the election is what they did. And so Goebel becomes governor. Well, he was shot right through here. The bullet worked around inside and broke his rib cage up pretty badly. Interior enters his lungs, and then of course it exited out of his back. If you visit the Kentucky History Center, you can see the coat that he was wearing when that happened, and a few days later he would pass on. But before he passed on, the judge swore him in as governor of the Commonwealth of Kentucky. This is his statue here. This statue used to sit over in South Frankfort in front of the new Capitol building, but so many people had automobile accidents bumping into it because it was out front that Bert Combs, during the last few days of his administration, in the middle of the night, moved this structure to this location. Now, if you will, come forward and take a look at his famous last words. It says, "Tell my friends to be brave and fearless and loyal to the great common people." His last words. Well, Irvin S. Cobb, a journalist and humorist who later made movies with Will Rogers, this was his first assignment for the Courier-Journal as a newspaper man. He stayed over on a building we'll see a little bit later on the trip. Well, he was talking with some of the folks that knew what had happened, and he tells us this story in one of his books. Goebel was lying there on his bed, just finishing his favorite meal, which was oysters. And he wiped his mouth, you know, and daintily said to the doc, he said, "You know, Doc, these sure were pretty damn bad oysters." And then he died. So we feel like that perhaps might not be the best last words to have on a monument for young gentlemen like yourselves to see. And instead we go with, "Tell my friends to be brave and fearless and loyal to the great common people." It's a great story. Well, we'll continue on our little walk. The railroad tracks that you see that run through Frankfort, this was the first railroad west of the Allegheny Mountains. It ran from Lexington to Frankfort, and it took about 5 hours to make the trip. The reason being, in the beginning, they used horses to pull the cars. They had to stop at the top of the hill, let everybody out, and then they would get on some sort of a rigged edifice to come down the hill because it was so dangerous for a train. The tunnel was built about 1848, 1850 or so, and once they had the tunnel, they could come right on into town without having to make the long run. Come on, walk this way. It was kind of interesting. The road situation, transportation was so poor in the early days, not just in Frankfort, but in most of the outlying communities in what was known as the West at that time, between like Midway and Versailles, or as you were going to Louisville, you would have towns like Bridgeport, and then Shelbyville and Middletown and others along the way. That's where you stayed the night, in those little towns, because you didn't dare want to be on the road at night in the old days because of robbers, as well as you can't see. And you would probably break an axle on the stagecoach or have some kind of a problem with your horse. So transportation was very difficult. The man by the name of Thomas Barlow built a steam engine over in Lexington, Kentucky. He's a man maybe you remember from your school days. There used to be this little planetarium that they had. It would go around the sun and all the planets would work around it. He invented that as well. Don't know for sure if he invented the Barlow knife, but he did invent this steam engine. And it finally worked and came over to Frankfort and went as fast as 12 miles an hour, which was really moving. That means only 2 hours to get from Lexington to Frankfort. It would stop here in Frankfort because they didn't have enough money. Plus there was the river. They didn't know about making a bridge. Eventually there would be trains coming from Louisville to Frankfort on the other side of the river, and they would get off there and work their way around. Notice the face on the side of the Gershman building there at the top. This stern-looking gentleman with his mustache, perhaps horns on his head, he seems to be looking in a direction toward the old Capitol. Now, we asked the Gershmans across the street the story behind that face, and they have no idea why it's there or how it came to be placed there on their building. So we don't have an answer. But perhaps the way he's looking in that direction, he was watching over state government for you and I, the taxpayers, because there was a lot of shenanigans that went on in that building. For instance, in 1888, our treasurer, Honest Dick Tate, was not at work one day. People got to checking around. Not only was he not at work, but neither was the treasurer. He absconded with $250,000, the entire state treasury, and he left, and we've never heard from him since. He was well utilized, much more so in the old days than it is today. In that corner, down at the opposite end, at Lewis and Broadway, was our first courthouse. It would burn to the ground and be destroyed. In the other corner, on the other side of the building, that was where we had our first arsenal. That too would burn, blow up literally, and be destroyed. On this corner was our very first church. It was a community church. It served the Presbyterians, the Baptists, some Catholics, and then when the Methodists came in, they decided it's about time we built our own buildings. And it was raised through a lottery. The first lottery in Kentucky was for $4,000 to build this community church, which would later on also succumb to fire and be destroyed. If you'll notice the three trees over here on the other side of the rock wall, this street, this little alley, is Madison Street. It used to go all the way down to the other side, Clinton, and down to Miro. And we want to step over here and get you out of the sun for a little bit. On this corner was a house that had two very famous people. First fellow that lived here in this house on the corner was our governor, George Madison. George Madison had been in the Revolutionary War, the Indian Wars, and several other battles, and he had been wounded many, many times. Had they been giving the Congressional Medal of Honor at that time, he would have probably got 4 or 5 of them for all the wounds that he had. He was so popular that nobody would run against him when he decided to run for governor, so he automatically got it. But he didn't get to keep it very long. He died within a few short weeks of being elected governor. Another fellow that lived in the same house was John Marshall Harlan. He was born down in Boyle County and lived in Harrodsburg as a little boy. Then his parents came to Frankfort, Kentucky, and they lived in this house. And he grew up here. He was a sheriff of Franklin County. He has a distinction in the Civil War as being one of the few people to ever defeat John Hunt Morgan. He got that, but he never got his real wish, and that was to be governor as well as to be the President of the United States. It never happened for him. But he did become a Supreme Court Justice in Washington. It's interesting to note his daddy named him after Thomas Marshall, the Supreme Court Justice, and here his son grows up to be a Supreme Court Justice as well. He was a dissenter. He did not go along with a lot of the laws that were being made following the Civil War, because much of the laws that they tried to pass were really putting the South down and the black people down as well. So he wouldn't go along with them. In 1972, they did a survey of all of the Supreme Court justices, and he was among the top 12. Later on, his grandson would also become Supreme Court Justice. It would be John Marshall Harlan Jr. under Dwight David Eisenhower. Now let's go up here and get you out of that sun. I promised I'd get you in the shade a little bit. Right about where this first tree is was another house, and it was actually out here where the grass is. This was the home of Solomon P. Sharp. Solomon P. Sharp was a good-looking dude. He came to Frankfort out of Bowling Green, Kentucky, and before he ever got here, down in Warren County, he got involved with a woman. Yes, indeed. Or do we have any lawyers on this trip today? He was a lawyer, and we're going to be doing a little lawyer bashing, I'm sure, along the way here. Old Solomon, good-looking dude he was, got this lady pregnant, and he left town. He comes to Frankfort. He starts to get involved in politics here in the capital city, marries the governor's daughter, and of course these stories were appearing in the newspapers. Way back down there in Warren County, Ann Cook, the defamed lady who lost her child in childbirth, she was just incensed and livid every time she would hear about this man. He became the Speaker of the House. He was one of the few politicians to ever beat John J. Crittenden, one of our great statesmen from Kentucky. He was magnificent. James Madison, the president, said that Solomon P. Sharp had the greatest mind of anybody west of the Allegheny Mountains. So he had a pretty good position. No telling what he might have become had he not gotten involved with this woman. There was another lawyer down there in Warren County by the name of Jeroboam Beecham. He too succumbed to the wiles of this Ann Cook. To make the story a little short, he basically says, what would it take to get you to marry me? And she said, I'll marry you if you'll kill Solomon P. Sharp. Okay, I'll do it. So they get married. A couple of years go by and she says, well, Jerry, I fulfilled my end of the bargain. What about you? When are you going to come across? Okay. So in 1826, he comes to Frankfort in a very cold month of November, comes up to the door, knocks on the door. Solomon P. Sharp comes in his nightgown and with his little candle, answers the door, and sticks him with a knife, kills him. Then he races back to Bowling Green. Well, within a week or so, they found out who had done it, and they bring back to Frankfort, Kentucky from Warren County not only Jeroboam Beecham, but also Ann Cook. And they put him in the jail. The jail, for those of you that live here in Frankfort, was where the St. John AME Church is located now. They put him in a dungeon way down under the ground. Well, Ann Cook, she said, we'll defeat the hangman. We'll kill ourselves. I brought some poison along. She had a little vial of laudanum. So they both took the laudanum, but there really wasn't enough in the vial to do any good, or maybe they were too ornery. Either way, it didn't kill them. So then they decided, well, I also happen to have in the folds of my skirt a knife. So she stabs herself and he stabs himself. She did a pretty good job. She was pretty aggressive. She dies. He doesn't quite die, but he's bleeding there. And when the authorities find out that he may die, they quickly race him out of the jail, put him on a wagon, and haul him up to the gallows up by the Frankfort Cemetery, and they hang him, bleeding and everything. And the two of them are buried together in the same coffin, arm in arm, clasped together. She wrote the epitaph that's over in Bloomfield, Kentucky at the Maple Grove Cemetery. She wrote the epitaph, and it's this big, huge, long slab. Unfortunately, it's cracked and broken, but they're there in there together, kind of like Bonnie and Clyde of their days. Well, this particular murder story was so popular all across the country that Edgar Allan Poe wrote a piece based on this murder. It's called Polition, and it's in play-like form. And you'll find it in his best hits collections. Also, another writer that wrote a story on it was Robert Penn Warren. It was called World Enough in Time, and that's an excellent book if you're interested in the history of the early days of Frankfort. Come this way. World Enough in Time is sort of fictionalized. He did indeed change the names of the characters, but his historical attitude about Frankfort, Kentucky was very, very accurate and very fascinating to read. George M. Bibb. He was a lawyer, he was a judge, he was a teacher of law. Any lawyers that were under his wing all advanced and went into high places. He became the Secretary of the Treasury of the United States of America under President John Tyler. He was very, very famous. Everybody knew George M. But he had a brother here in town that also was a legislator, had been in the War of 1812. But at the time, nobody really knew a whole lot about his brother John. But now, today, I venture to say that none of you had ever heard of George M. Bibb. But his brother, you have. And if it doesn't come to you at this point, it will a little later on our trip. In other words, all the things that he wants you to know his way would be in his paper. So Amos does this. He goes to Washington. And while he's there, Andrew Jackson promotes him. He promotes him to his inner circle in his kitchen cabinet. He becomes the Postmaster General of the United States. Well, he's having trouble trying to do that job and also run the newspaper, which was called the Globe. So he says, Andy, do you think it'd be possible if I got my buddy back in Frankfort to come here and run the paper for me and let me just do this other work? Sure, go ahead, I'll trust you. So Francis Preston Blair takes off with his family, and they go to Washington, and they build him a house there. Just so happens to be right across from the White House, and it's the Blair House today. All the dignitaries that come to visit the President of the United States will stay in the Blair House. All happened here on this corner in Frankfort. The house up here across the street, which is part of Herod Brothers Funeral Home, was the home of Landon Thomas. He was a lawyer and a legislator. Landon Thomas bought that property for $50, built that beautiful home. He's not so well known as much as his sister is. His sister, Emily Thomas, went down south and married a Georgia planter, and she became Emily Tubman. Well, a few years later, her husband dies, so she inherits millions of dollars from his estate, and she comes back to Frankfort and becomes a philanthropist. She helps out the Midway Girls School. She helps out the First Christian Church. They had a devastating fire. She paid over $30,000 out of her own money to rebuild the burnt-out portion of the First Christian Church. She also was an emancipationist. Now, these were people who believed that the slaves should have an opportunity to go back to Africa. Many of those slaves that were living here had come from Africa within the past 20, 30 years, and they remembered home. So she paid for about 75 families their passage across the Atlantic to Africa, to what a country now is called Liberia. And one of the families were not too excited about Africa. They wanted to come back to Kentucky. When she found out about it, she went ahead and paid their passage as well. She was a great lady. The First Christian Church has an Emily Tubman Circle room and a picture there of her as well. This is our Episcopal Church. This church was given to the flock by one of its members, John Harris Hanna. John went all over Europe trying to find just the right look for the church. So it's kind of Gothic in its look. There originally was a steeple on this section over here on the right. It was hit by lightning and it was destroyed, and they never put another one back, mainly because they didn't have very much money. In fact, prior to this church building being built in about 1848-49, they were just sort of like a fledgling group of people, about 20 or so, trying to make it work. And they got $1,000 given to them by the Church of the Ascension in Greenwich Village, New York. The church is still there today. And because of the $1,000 gift, they decided that they would name their church. The Episcopal Church would be called the Church of the Ascension. There's some interest here because John Harris Hanna, his wife, happened to be the daughter of Kentucky's first millionaire. And he died in about 1848-49, and she inherited all his money out of Lexington. So it's possible that this church may have been built on her bank account instead of her husband's. Now, he was the first president of the Farmers Bank and Capital Trust Company, so it's possible he might have taken it out of the bank. Who knows? No. Across the street is the Benjamin Cave Milam House. Benjamin Cave Milam is known for many things, one of which was his fishing reels. Actually, he was an entrepreneur, is what it turns out to be. Two boys down the street, the Meek brothers, had a jewelry shop, and they were making fishing reels that, word got out, these were incredible fishing reels. Presidents of the United States would send to little old Frankfort, Kentucky to get these fishing reels. Well, Benjamin Cave Milam saw that, so he buys the guys out. For a time, it's the Meek Milam fishing reel, and then later on, it's just the Milam fishing reel. And he goes all over the world selling the fishing reels, and they're still available today. The Kentucky History Center has in their collection some of those old Milam reels, and they are indeed beautiful if you are a fisher person. Up here on the corner, on the right, was the home of Philip Swigert. Now, Philip Swigert was one of the type of men that makes a city grow and develop. He too was a lawyer, He was a man who was in on everything. Any form of transportation, he was one of the guys behind it, whether it be the railroads, the regular roads, or whether it be steamship ideas, or not steamship, I guess I should say boating back in those days. He was a part of all that. He also started our first water reservoir. We had running water in Frankfort, Kentucky. Up on Cedar Cove Hill, he built a 25-foot retaining wall, part of which still stands today. It's been breached, obviously. And they took old cedar logs, hewed them out inside, and fitted them together like straws, and they brought them by gravity all the way down here to the city of Frankfort, and the water would flow gravitational right down to about 8 wells that were in different points of the city. That was one of his ideas. It worked pretty good, made some money off of it. Another one of his ideas didn't work so well was the Frankfort woolen mills, because during the Civil War, the woolen mills, this town was taken over by the Confederates. And while they were here, they bought a bunch of jeans, and the jeans, by the way, looked a lot like this kind of material rather than the denim that you're wearing. They bought it with Confederate money, which obviously wasn't worth anything, so actually he lost about $76,000 or so on that transaction. Didn't do too good on that one. This house later would become the home of Colonel E.H. Taylor, distillery fame, and this is a beautiful house. When we look on the other side of the house, we'll see that this house is a house over top of another house. We'll see that when we make the turn around the quarter. This big beautiful building here was built about 1810. Several people lived here. One of them was John Harvey, a Virginia planter who settled in Franklin County, made a lot of money, and he was a big buddy to Henry Clay. When Henry Clay first got his start as a politician, lived in Lexington, Kentucky at Ashland. Well, he was a representative over here in Frankfort at our legislature before he became a United States congressman. And he would stay in this house when he was here in Frankfort. Remember I talked about how poorly the roads were and everything? To travel back and forth from Lexington to his home, even though it's just 20-25 miles away, would just be impossible because it would take too long. So he stayed in this house with John Harvey. Another person that lived here was a minister by the name of Moore, his last name, and he was on a first-name basis with Alexander Campbell, who started the Christian church. And Alexander Campbell was here on several occasions and stayed in this house too. But the most prominent person that lived here was Charles Slaughter Moorhead. He was one of our governors. In fact, he appreciated Franklin County so much because they helped elect him to governor that he named one of his children Franklin. He's buried up in the Frankfort Cemetery. He has his own nice, big, beautiful monument. Then he has the rest of his family, real small stones. And there's one of them that says Franklin on it. This is the law offices today of Big Bill Johnson, premier defense attorney, and we appreciate Mr. Johnson for remodeling this building. It took a lot of money and effort, and he wanted to put it back as much as he could the way it originally was. It did not have the Johnson, Judy, True, and Garneri attorneys at law sign on it at that time. Most of these older homes, you would have a real long section of the block taken up by them. You would have gardens for their vegetables that they would grow, and you would also have a barn or a livery like a stable for their horses and for their wagons. Now the horses are a little different. Usually in this parking lot are a bunch of BMWs and Mercedes and things like that. Notice the old place, the old section where they have taken down what probably was some form of a porch. They removed that years ago. Then you take a look at this chimneys and the structure of the building. It's just really a wonderful, beautiful place. And I'll go ahead and say this on cable TV. Big Bill Johnson invites anyone Monday through Friday, if you're down in the area during the daytime, to drop by and take a look inside the house. They welcome visitors at that home. Across the street was the residence of John Goodman. Not to be confused with Roseanne Barr's old buddy, John Goodman, on the Roseanne show. This was the John Goodman house. He was a musician. He not only played music and taught music, but he built musical instruments. He built an organ for the Church of the Ascension we talked about. He also built a piano for Governor Garrett's daughter. Garrett was, I believe, the second governor of the Commonwealth. Well, that piano still is in existence today. It's in Liberty Hall and still works, still plays. As you can see, this building is in really rough shape. The wooden areas there that you can see that are rotting and ready to fall apart. Recently, this property was purchased by Franklin County Fiscal Court. The old State Journal News building, they've moved out to another part of town. They're going to turn this into the family court offices, and this was going to be made into a parking lot. But we kind of worked it out to where we saved this building. Now, whether they retain it all or just keep the facade, we're not sure how that's all going to work out, but we will save it. Right down the street there is the Governor Owsley house. Thomas Marshall once lived there. One of our doctors lived there as well. This year, we had a devastating fire in the early evening hours. Some cigarettes, I believe, in a restroom area ignited and caused that building to be, it looks to me like, destroyed. I'm not sure about what the future of that is going to be.
I talked to the firemen. They said they're probably going to
Gonna have to tear it down. I don't know exactly what's going to happen to the old Owsley building. This building here on the corner is the Chapman Coleman Todd house. This is where he lived. It was built by, I believe, a bookseller. It's hard to believe that in the early pioneer days, this little town had several bookstores. And this man here did pretty good because he built this beautiful house. Chapman Coleman Todd, his relative, was one of the first admirals of the United States Navy. He was down to explore the Orinoco River in South America. He's one of the first white people to explore down in that area. Notice the fan light there. It's really beautiful. That's one of our traditions of the antebellum homes. And then across the street in the Charles S. Slaughter house is another fan light at the very, very top. You can see it there at the top. These four corners, really, if you kind of squint your eyes and get rid of the electric wires and the stoplights and the traffic and the modern day other ideas, you can almost be transported back to 1810 to 1820 because they were here at that time. As we cross Washington Street, by the way, this town was started by James Wilkinson. He put together the streets and named them. He named Washington Street, obviously, for George Washington. Ann Street was named for his wife. St. Clair was named for one of the generals of the Revolutionary War that he was under. And, of course, this street, which we know today as Main Street, was originally called Montgomery Street for Richard Montgomery, a general whom all of the soldiers loved. He was killed at the Battle of Quebec. Montgomery County, Kentucky is named for him as well. This house on the corner was the home of the individual I believe that is really the greatest statesman of Kentucky, because this man was everything we want a politician to be. He was honest, he was forthright, he said what he thought, he backed up everything he said, and he was truly a genuine man. John J. Crittenden is the man who lived here. He was born in a log cabin that still stands today just outside of Versailles on US 60 near the Methodist home over there. His family went on to western Kentucky in Logan County, Russellville, and he became a lawyer. He also came to Frankfort as a legislator, fell in love with the town, said this is the place to be. So in about 1819 or 20 or so, he bought this house. This house was built on property that once was owned by Aaron Burr. That's another story, and we'll get to him a little later on. John J. Crittenden was the United States Attorney General twice. He was United States U.S. Senator on several occasions. He was governor of Kentucky. We've got a sign here that talks about some of his efforts here in the Commonwealth of Kentucky, known for the Crittenden Compromise during the Civil War. He had two sons that were generals during the Civil War, one on each side, one for the Union and one for the Confederacy. And it was pretty much a difficult time for this family to undergo the problems they had. He had a grandson, John J. Crittenden III, who was killed at the Battle of the Little Bighorn with George Armstrong Custer. This particular stop that I'm standing on here is one of the old impediments from one of these original old capitals that burned down. So one of the things left, we got one here and one down there and another one a little farther on. And this is what the Crittendens would use to get out of their carriage and to step onto. And he would often stand here and pontificate to all the people that would welcome him back home after he'd been out on one of his tours. So this was a place where not only he stood, but also other individuals like Daniel Webster and Zachary Taylor. Zachary Taylor was on his way to Washington to become inaugurated as President of the United States, and he stopped here in Frankfort primarily to get Crittenden to be his Secretary of State. There, that stone, well, that is the house of Preston Brown. He was a doctor in our community, a brother to John Brown of Liberty Hall fame, and he originally lived there. And then when Mr. Swigert bought the property, he added that front part. You can actually see the seams there of the bricks, how they're different. And he added the front part on all the way across the top, down in the back, all the way to the alley down here, and it became his big mansion. He too would have in his rear, there would be vegetables that they would grow for their gardens, and also there would be the horses and the livery and everything on their property. That's the way they did those houses back then. The house that we're approaching here on my left, or actually your left, my right, is the influence of New Orleans. When James Wilkinson put together the little town of Frankfort, he had this great idea of making Frankfort a base of trade. He lived in Lexington, and he came to Frankfort. He said, why can't we put our goods, our tobacco, on flatboats, float them down the Kentucky River, down the Ohio River, down the Mississippi to New Orleans, where we will have an opportunity to sell our goods, and the Spaniard would want to buy them. Well, that was all well and good, you know, to try to send your crops and everything across the Allegheny Mountains to the eastern shore would be futile because everything would be destroyed before it ever got there. But to get down the river, you could do it. The only problem was the United States was kind of at odds with Spain. They owned the Mississippi River, and we weren't allowed to use it. So James Wilkinson and his friends, a lot of the people in this town, they said, let's go for it, let's try it. So they sneaked down there to New Orleans. The Spanish just thought it was great. They sold their first boatload, $6,000. And that's a lot of money back in those days. So consequently, they would then tear up the boats and then walk back or take a boat around the Gulf and come up through another way to come back home. So this became an idea. And Wilkinson actually got involved as an ambassador, so to speak, for Spain on the take, or under the table, however you want to put it. And he was literally doing illegal things, but he never got caught. So I guess that's all right. Aaron Burr, he got caught. One of the people that lived in this house was Justice of the Supreme Court, James Hazelrig. He was called one night from his supper to go up to the old Capitol Hotel and to swear in Governor Goebel as governor of Kentucky after he'd been shot. A couple of nights later, while he was eating his supper, he was called out again to swear in the lieutenant governor as governor after Goebel would die. Beautiful home. You'll see quite a few houses in Frankfort that have this feel of New Orleans. This is one of our street markers from the early 1900s, and it says Petticoat Lane. Well, this is Petticoat Lane right here. Now, Petticoat Lane is only this area between here and the next street, Wapping Street. We wondered often how it got its name. Found out there was a girl that lived down on Wapping Street, Patty Burnley, and she had a girlfriend that lived in the house that was on this side, on this corner. This was where the Pepper House was. It was a distillery family, and the two girls would often visit each other and go up and down this alley. And so because the streets weren't paved back in those days, they were muddy or they were real dusty, the girls would hold their dress up and walk down there, and they would show their petticoats. And that's how it got to be called Petticoat Lane. Across the street is the First Presbyterian Church. This church originally was on Wapping Street over by the river where the Catholic Church is, they decided they didn't want to deal with all the riffraff that was on the river and all the noise and everything. They wanted to move to a different location. So they built their church here. And it just so happened they got finished with the building the same time Zachary Taylor was visiting Governor Crittenden up here on the corner. The Crittendens went to church here, and Zachary Taylor also professed to be a Presbyterian at that time, so they all got together on Sunday and had a big time at the church, sort of a send-off. As you see, they're doing renovation work here. What they're trying to do is reestablish their bell tower. They've had some problems with the building and everything, so they're refurbishing it. I think they got together like $200,000 from their own church to do it, and maybe a couple of $100,000 grants from somebody else to make this all happen. It's a beautiful church. One of the ministers in the early 1900s, Reverend Ziegler, was on his way to England on a boat trip, and he met a very famous architect from Chicago. Anybody want to take a guess?
Oh, I can't.
Frank Lloyd Wright. And they became fast friends. And he was telling Mr. Wright that he had this idea for a house. So Mr. Wright says, I'll help you. And we have it today over on Shelby Street in South Frankfort, the Frank Lloyd Wright house, or the Ziegler house. Now, he didn't build the house. It was just his plans. In fact, I think the only Frank Lloyd Wright other structure in Kentucky is over in Jefferson County, where Watterson, what is it, Parkway or whatever it's called, Expressway, Watterson Expressway and I-64 meet. There's that old building there, used to be an insurance company and a phone company. It's that big high, tall building. That was one that his company designed. He was already dead, but it was his company. This beautiful structure here is the LeBreau Taylor House. It is now the home of Stites and Harbison, another law firm in town. And again, it takes those prestigious law firms to maintain structures such as this, to keep them up as they were. Mr. Taylor was one of the distillers, son of Colonel E.H. Taylor. The LeBreau was the Frenchman who came to Kentucky with the idea of building a winery. And it didn't work because of the climate here. Of course, we have wineries now in Kentucky, but you're able to do more and construct your own climate to make it work. So he got into the whiskey business, and his beautiful distillery is over on Grassyland Pike, just a few minutes outside of Frankfort off of US 60. And if you've never been to take the tour, it's free. It's a first-class trip, and I highly recommend that you take some time out and go. They really do it right. You get to see the huge copper kettles where the whiskey is being made. It's absolutely fantastic. This house across the street, that's the Thomas Crittenden house. John J. Crittenden's son, the Union General, Thomas Leonidas Crittenden, lived there for a time. He was also the consul to Liverpool in England. Very, very interesting gentleman.
Got a good soccer team too.
This particular house, there's only 4 like it, they believe, in the Commonwealth of Kentucky. It is put together through a little different construction. You really can't see it because of the clapboard exterior, but it's logs with stone and brick together to create the structure there. And there's only like 3 others besides this one in Kentucky. Back in the 70s, there was an attempt to strike this, raise it, tear it down, and to build another structure. But the local folks interested in preserving our history put a stop to that, so we still have it today. Next door to it is a little house that's referred to often as Hallett Hall. Now, during the Civil War, this county was very much divided. We had close to 200 fellows who were part of the Confederacy and about 225 that were part of the Union. So we were pretty much evenly divided here in Frankfort, Kentucky. In this little white house, a lady by the name of Mary Todd lived, Mary Willis Todd. She had a boy, Franklin Todd, who was in the Civil War, fighting for the Union. He was down at the Battle of Perryville, and he lost his arm. So consequently, he was given a discharge, but he so much enjoyed being a part of the camaraderie and everything, he wanted to re-enlist anyway, so he did. And so consequently he would go down to Murfreesboro, Stones River as Confederates would call it, and he lost his life there. But there was another boy from Frankfort at that same battle in Murfreesboro, Tennessee, who was for the other side, the Confederacy. His name was Woodson, his last name, and he saw the flag bearers get shot 1, 2, 3 in a row. That was one of the great things to do, was to take out the person carrying the flag, because that would take away some of the morale of the soldiers if they would see their flag down, especially falling. Well, 3 fellows had gotten shot, and this boy from Frankfort raked up there and grabbed it, and he held it, and he too was killed as well. Well, his daddy was a widower. He winds up about 3 years after the war marrying this woman. So we have the kind of a coming together, you might say, of the North and the South right here. And the boys are both buried up in the Frankfort Cemetery. If you look at this building, right straight above the doorway, and then between the 2 windows, at the very bottom of the windows, you'll see an irregularity of the bricks. It was about in that area where a cannonball apparently was lodged in this building. Some folks doing renovation work found the evidence of this happening, and this happened from a battle that occurred during the Civil War. You can't see much of it from here, but Fort Hill is just to the right of that tower there, the Plaza Tower, and Fort Hill was very prominent to our little community. In 1862, the Confederates came into Frankfort and inaugurated their own governor and made this a southern town for a few days. The Federals would come in very quickly and take it back over again, and this was the first and the only capital of the North, or of a Union persuasion, to be taken over by the Confederates during the Civil War. In 1864, things were going bad for the South anyway, and John Hunt Morgan was doing what he could to just really take over. And his men were absolutely pillaging and stealing and robbing. They weren't the bold individuals that they were at one time. They began to be like thugs. They robbed the bank over in Mount Sterling in Montgomery County, just took and kept for themselves. It didn't get back to where it was supposed to go, at least so the story goes. Well, they wanted to come into Frankfort, Kentucky to hit our arsenal and to also take over the courthouse and destroy the Capitol building, burn it up. But we had some defense. They got up on this hill here. Fort Hill is what it's called, and then the people in the community, the local militia, they got together and held off the Confederates, and they went on over to Cynthiana instead, and they destroyed Cynthiana, burned their courthouse down, and had some pretty tough times. So we had a lot of problems in our little community during the Civil War, and it's been said, had it not been for the efforts of those soldiers up there on Fort Hill, or citizenry, I guess we could say, the state militia, our local people, that maybe the capital would have been moved over to Louisville, Kentucky, because the Jefferson County Courthouse had really been built with the idea that it might be the capital of Kentucky, the building, if they ever changed it to Louisville. But it isn't. This is the capital, and here is where we are. We're approaching one of the granddaddies of our old buildings here in Frankfort, and that's Liberty Hall. Liberty Hall is over 200 years old. It's constructed about 1798 or so. John Brown, not to be confused with the John Brown's body lies a-mouldering in the grave, not that man, nor is this man connected to any of our governors. We've had 2 with the name of John Brown. He was from Stanton, Virginia, this man was, and he was a lawyer, and he was a man who knew the first 5 presidents on a first-name basis, good friend of Thomas Jefferson. When you look at the structure of the building, it almost has a Jeffersonian feel to it. No doubt, maybe Jefferson gave him some ideas. He originally was going to build this house for his mom and dad, who were retiring, but then he fell in love with Margaretta Preston, and he wound up marrying her, and this became their house. He built the home for his mom and dad over in Woodford County, probably 2 days away as far as being able to muddle, if that be the case. They built the building right out of the backyard. The bricks were built out of the backyard, clay. They actually had Venetian blinds back in those days. The glass was sent over the hills and down around Philadelphia and brought down the Kentucky River and from the Ohio River. So this is really an outstanding building. John Brown was our first senator when we became a state. He and Jonathan Edwards was the first to represent our community and our state. Right here at this point, right about here, is where President James Monroe stood in 1829, I believe, June the 30th, if I'm not mistaken, I could be. To the left of him was an aide, to the right of him was an aide. This man was Zachary Taylor, and this man was Andrew Jackson. So we had three presidents standing right here at one time visiting. Now James Monroe came here primarily to see James Brown. Not to be confused with a soul singer. This is another James Brown. It's the brother to John Brown. John Brown had been the ambassador to France that took the Monroe Doctrine to the French government for James Monroe. So they were fast friends. There's all sorts of stories connected with this beautiful old home and its people. One of the problems the early settlers had was babies dying in childbirth or not living very long. A lot of doctors didn't realize washing your hands and washing your implements would make a difference in saving lives. They didn't know about the germs. So a lot of lives were lost, a lot of babies. This family here lost several of their children. They had a boy by the name of Orlando. He made it, and John Mason Brown made it. They had a little girl that made it, Euphemia. She made it only for just a few years, and then she too would die. And when this happened, it just destroyed John and his wife Margaretta. So they withdrew from society and would have nothing more to do in the community. They just stayed in their house. And it's really sad for them because they've been so much a part of the community. Lafayette, the old general that had been such a big help to the Revolutionary War veterans here for the United States, he was coming over to visit, and he wanted to especially visit Frankfort for two reasons. As an old man, he was here because he wanted to see Anthony Crockett, a man who lived here in Frankfort that's buried in the Frankfort Cemetery. Crockett had carried Lafayette from the battlefield during the Revolutionary War and saved him from being taken prisoner by the British. No telling what they might have done to him had they gotten him. That was one of the reasons he wanted to come here, but the other was Margaretta Mason Brown, Preston Brown rather. He wanted to see her because her daddy had been the chaplain of his, the Revolutionary War chaplain during the war. So he knew a lot of stories about her father, and he was so sad when she didn't show up at the big ball that they had down at what is the State National Bank now, the old hotel, the Weisiger Inn. And so when he found out that she wasn't coming, he left his own party and came down here himself and stayed about an hour and visited with her. She, along with another friend down the street, Elizabeth Love, started the first Sunday school west of the Allegheny Mountains. They started it over here in the garden that you'll see as we walk past. Now, these two trees in the front yard are catalpa trees, and they were here before the house was. So they're older than the house. In fact, you'll see how they're trying to support the tree and keep it going. As you walk past, look at the trunk and the base of it, you can actually look right through the tree. It's in really bad shape, but it's hanging on. It's green and is surviving the drought of 1999 and doing quite well. Another thing about John Brown, he was one of those that was on that boat that Washington was in when he crossed the Delaware. So every time you see that picture of crossing the Delaware, you'll think in terms of John Brown being somewhere back there too. The house that is coming up to the right was the home of his son, Orlando Brown. We'll talk about that in a moment. After that daughter died, Margaretta's aunt came from New York all the way to Frankfort to console her, and she hadn't been here but a few days when she would herself die, and she was buried somewhere in the back property there. Their ground stretches all the way down to the Kentucky River. It's right on the other side of those trees, and it was just a horrible thing. In the 1960s, they had a fire in the building there. It was not a serious fire, but it required some renovation and some painting. And once it was all done, they took pictures of their work. And one of the photographs of the staircase shows this woman with her hand on the banister coming down dressed in gray, and you can see right through her. They think it may be the lady that came, the aunt, to console Margareta. Don't really know. Back in the early 60s, when I first came to Frankfort, I worked for the radio station. I heard this story. I wanted to do a radio show on Halloween inside Liberty Hall and see if we could get in touch with the gray ghost, the gray lady. They would not do that. No, no, that would be beneath the dignity of this house. Nowadays, it's a great story and it gets a lot of people to come by, so a little more lenient with the stories now. Kind of gets more visitors. The house over here on the left, this is a condominium, but the original house that once was here has been destroyed. It was burned down in the 70s. Some little boys got in there on some wintry night, built a fire. It got out of hand and the house was totally destroyed. But it was built by Harry Ennis Todd. He was a riverboat captain, real big burly man. He wanted a house that would be big enough to accommodate his frame and his structure, so he built one of the biggest houses that Frankfort had. It was unoccupied at the time when these boys got in it, and it burnt to the ground. This is the home of Orlando Brown, John's son. It was built by Gideon Schrock about 1835 or so. It's said to be the only residence that Schrock ever built. Another one of Schrock's famous buildings is in Little Rock, Arkansas, and that's the state house that Bill Clinton was in when he was the governor of Arkansas. Of course, you know who Bill Clinton is. Orlando Brown was a newspaper man, served quite well. And I might say, too, that this town was so closely knit with all these politicians and their connections. You had the Browns, you had the Crittendens, and you had people like Zachary Taylor, Tom Crittenden, that we talked about, the father of the boy that got killed with George Armstrong Custer. They could just say, Zach, have you got room for my son? Would you see that maybe he could be with Custer? And all these kinds of things would just work magic, you know. Still going like that today, I understand, in some families, in some sections. If you notice the house through the trees there that has all the windows, that was the home of John Glover South. He was an ambassador to the Panama. His wife was the daughter of Kentucky's first Republican governor. There was a relative of hers that was also a Republican governor, Edwin Porch Morrow. He spent some time in that house. And then there was another governor, Simeon P. Willis, who was a Republican that lived in that house. So one would think, hey, if I'm going to run for governor and I'm of the Republican persuasion, I need to have some connection to that house. One more fact you need to remember is Edwin Porch Morrow died in that house as well after he had been governor of Kentucky. To see this beautiful structure that he had built. Not this house. This was built in the 1870s. She takes one look at it and she says, if you think I'm going to live in this two-house town, you've got another thing coming. I'm going back to Lexington. She did, and so did he. He sold the structure to Andrew Holmes, Kelly Sneed, and some others, and they wound up using this building. This is where our legislature first met when we became a state, while they were building our government buildings over there on the big square while we were at earlier. So this was used for that purpose. The first sermon preached in Frankfort was here in this same old building. Later on, this building will be sold to the Love family, and they would turn it into a tavern. Now, most of us think of a tavern as being a place where you kind of do this. But in reality, back in those days, the taverns were your modern motels that we have today. So you would have these little taverns all throughout all of our communities in different states as well. These are the places you'd stop and stay all night. Well, this was a real swinging place, right next to the ferry, right close to all the action here in downtown Frankfort, so everybody would stay here. Among those that stayed here was Aaron Burr, who, as you know, was considered to be a traitor. His first trial that he ever had as a traitor was in Frankfort, Kentucky. But he got himself a hotshot lawyer. No, not Big Bill Johnson. He got Henry Clay, and Henry Clay got him off. It would be another lawyer somewhere else that would eventually get to Aaron Burr for his what they called treason and his idea of working and aligning with Spain. So a lot of the nefarious activities happened on this corner. Another one of the guests that was at this house was King Louis Philippe. He was in exile. He would become King of France in 1830 and served for quite a few years. Well, he was here in Frankfort, and everybody was all excited about the king being here. And so they had a big dance up on the second floor of the old log house. And after the dance really got started and everything, the king asked Elizabeth Love, his hostess, if she would dance with him. And she turned him down. Well, this embarrassed all of her friends. They couldn't believe, after the dance was over and everybody was gone and everything, Lizzie, how could you on earth turn down the King of France when he asked you to dance? She said, well, my neighbor's son from down the street had just asked me to dance prior to that, and I had turned him down, and I didn't think it would be right to dance with anyone, including the King of France, if I wouldn't dance with my own neighbor's son. She's a very gracious lady. In fact, it's believed that she is the first woman to be buried in our Frankfort cemetery. And while she was a great lady to our community, her tombstone is a very little tiny, petite stone up there in the Frankfort cemetery with just Elizabeth Love. We'll cross the street, and as we cross, look at this building on the corner and see how far its walls go all the way down past that red car to that tree. This was built in the early 1900s, about 1910 or 1912, and as we walk, watch the culvert over here by the curb because it kind of drops down, so watch your footing. This was built by Graham Vreeland. He was the editor of the Frankfort State Journal, and he named this Vauxhall, V-A-U-X-H-A-L-L, I believe is the pronunciation or spelling of it. It means garden hall. And in more recent times, this was the home of Judge Henry Meigs. Judge Henry Meigs, in a story that you don't often hear, he was one of the flyboys during World War II that shot down Yamamoto. And you take Yamamoto out of the picture during the World War II, and the Japanese, as you know, didn't make it. And of course, that was that story. This tree is the ginkgo tree. This is the male tree. The female tree has a very horrible odor. Somebody came through Frankfort in the early 1900s and planted these all over town. They're everywhere. And I found out that in November, just through the process of living here for all those years, these leaves will turn a beautiful yellow, and they will take on the texture of almost like velour or like velvet. While they don't have a smell or an odor, they will keep, and they're very, very pretty. And I had heard that these leaves would all fall off the same day when they fall. Instead of, be like most trees taking maybe weeks to lose all their leaves, these leaves, for the most part, all fall off in the course of one day. Well, over in South Frankfort, on 4th Street, near where I live, there's one at the corner of Capitol and 4th. And I noticed that the leaves were beginning to fall. And I said, should I go find my wife, Karen, and let her see this thing happen as well? But if I'm gone trying to find her, maybe all the leaves will fall and I'll miss it. So I selfishly decided to stay and watch it myself. And it went on and on and on. I didn't realize. I thought it would happen, like 15 minutes or something. It took hours for it to fall. I didn't stay for the whole event. But also it becomes dangerous as well, because when they get on the street, there's about a 2-inch to 3-inch pile of these slippery leaves, and cars have difficulty with them. This beautiful house here is Gray Gables, the home of a guy who we talked about on the other side of town. Remember I talked about George Bibb being so popular, and his brother was not very famous at all? Well, this was the home of John Bibb, who was a lawyer as well as a legislator, and he also liked to fool around in his backyard gardening. And he developed in the backyard here Bibb lettuce. So those of you that have enjoyed in your salads the wonderful Bibb lettuce, this is where it all got its start. This is also the house that Patty Burnley lived in, the little girl in the petticoats we talked about. She loved the arts, and she would entertain the authors and painters and people that were involved in culture. She did so for many, many years. She was a spinster. She never married, and she also prided herself on never letting anybody know how old she was. Unfortunately, when she passed on and they buried her up in the Frankfort Cemetery, somebody put her birth date as well as her death date, and now we know that she lived to be quite old. Among those that she entertained here in this house was John Fox Jr., who wrote The Little Shepherd of Kingdom Come. His book became so popular, and he wrote it in the dialect of Eastern Kentucky. He sold the first 1,000,000 books of any Kentucky author, so that all across the world and all over the United States, people thought that Kentuckians all talk like this, you know, up there, and all that sort of thing. That's the way they wrote, see? That's the way he wrote in the dialect. And so he made a lot of people think that we were all hillbillies. That's where it got started. She also entertained Robert Burns Wilson here, and he is, of course, a poet who 101 years ago wrote Remember, Remember the Maine, in a building about 2 blocks from here that still stands to this day. It became the battle hymn of the Spanish-American War. And he wrote that poem here in Frankfort, Kentucky. To hell with Spain, remember the Maine. This house was the Carneal House. Thomas Carneal, one of the founders of Covington, Kentucky, built this house. If you're up in Covington, right across from where the Reds play and the Bengals play, at least right now anyway, is the Carneal House. It's a huge, huge structure. Well, this is the house that he lived in. You notice it has the New Orleans effect as well on it. Now across the street, in this big white house on the other side of Wapping Street, is the home of 2 famous people. One was Hugh Rodman. Hugh Rodman was an admiral during World War I. He was the admiral in charge of the Pacific Fleet at one time. He also served during the time of ships with sails and the wooden ships, so he was quite a sailor. Another fellow that lived in that house was Fayette Hewitt. Fayette Hewitt, during the Confederate operations during the Civil War, was actually the Assistant Adjutant General under the Confederate President, who was Jefferson Davis, right. He also was shot out from under he had about 3 horses shot out from under him. He lived here, and after he was done with his war days, he became the president of the State National Bank. Got to give credit to both of these banks in town. This beautiful little garden you see here is the Ida Lee Willis Garden. Ida Lee Willis was Simeon Willis's wife, the Republican governor. She heard that there was an organization out of Louisville coming to Frankfort to build a state office building, and they were going to tear this building down here on the corner, the Vess Lindsay House. So she goes to Ned Breathitt, and being a former First Lady, she had a little clout, and she says, Ned, we can't let them do this. We've got to stop it. He agreed with her. They created the Heritage Commission, which put an end to all these homes being torn down. On the next corner up the street was a beautiful home called the Terraces that wound its way all the way down to the river, and it too was destroyed. Big parking lot put up there. So consequently she says, let's not let this happen anymore. Ned, being the good, smart governor he was, he says, you're right, we'll save that house. But he also said, we'll keep the old new state office building too, and that's it right there, the Justice Cabinet. This is the Bush building. And all they did, you see what common sense and logic can do? Rather than tear the building down, they just built the new building several feet behind, and we got both. We've got the state office building, got a beautiful garden here in memory of Ida Lee Willis, and we got this beautiful house as well. Several folks lived here that were quite famous. One was just a little boy when he lived in Frankfort, Kentucky. His name was George Graham Best, and he left Kentucky and went on to mature in the state of Missouri. He became a senator there and a lawyer, and one of his trials that he was involved in, someone killed their neighbor's dog, and in his summation he used the phrase, dog is man's best friend. And he lived here in this house when he was a little fellow. Another fellow that lived here was Daniel Lindsay. He was the man who kind of rallied the troops there in 1864 at Fort Hill and organized the local militia and to holding off the Confederates when they came to town. This is where he lived. Across the street on that corner, that home was built by Robert Perkins Letcher about 1840, 1845. He had been governor of Kentucky. He's one of the men who came up with the idea of having the Frankfort Cemetery. Now, our cemetery in town is the second incorporated cemetery in the United States, the first being Boston. And Robert Perkins Letcher and Mr. Swigert and some other businessmen thought, you know, if we built this beautiful cemetery and put all different unique plants and everything in it, and also went and put famous people in it, people will come to see our town and come to see our graveyard. We'll dig up Daniel Boone. We'll dig up other governors. We'll put them all up there. And of course, they're there today, or at least we think they're there today. That is another story, and the way you laughed, I think you all know that story. Across the street is the Justice Thomas Todd house. Thomas Todd had lied about his age and gotten into the Revolutionary War. He was sort of without family, so he was sort of taken under the wing by a bunch of people who wound up settling in Kentucky. Judge Harry Ennis and some of the others took him under his wing. He grew up here in what became Frankfort, Kentucky, got involved in politics. Later he would become the Supreme Court Justice under Thomas Jefferson. And while he was there and serving in Washington, he would marry the sister of Dolly Madison, who was married to President James Madison. And that's the reason James Madison came to Frankfort to visit. Not because we had such a wonderful little town or anything, but because his sister-in-law lived here in this house. Now, from what I've been told, this house didn't have the beautiful little gables it has today. It was more of just the front structure there without the gables. That was added later. The building behind me, that's behind the trees that we're approaching, is what we know today as the Paul Sawyer Library. The building originally was built over 100 years ago. It was our federal building. The courts were held upstairs. Post office was downstairs. In the early 60s, this became the Paul Sawyer Library. Paul Sawyer, as most of you folks from Frankfort know, was a painter. And he loved to paint. And he painted hundreds and hundreds of sketches of different views of Frankfort, Franklin County, Elkhorn Creek, Kentucky River, on down the Kentucky River, Brooklyn Bridge, and other places. And he has quite a record of what our town and our place looked like in the late 1800s and early 1900s. Because he loved to paint so much, he knew that he would not be able to support a wife. He had a lady that he was in love with, Mamie Bull, but they never did get married. His daddy apparently had something like Alzheimer's. His father would often board the train here in Frankfort and wind up in other cities, and they would find him maybe a week or so later. He lived, the Sawyer family lived, over on Broadway, right where the Kentucky History Center is located now, right across from the train depot. So it was very easy for Mr. Sawyer to just cross the street, get on a train, and take off wherever it would take him. Well, he was in such bad shape that his wife said to Paul, the son, "You're going to have to come here and be with us." They lived behind this Baptist church building down across the street in an old parsonage that was given to the family, and that's where she stayed, and Paul worked with her and took care of their daddy until he would pass on. This building here is the Good Shepherd Catholic Church, Part 1. The new church is out on the Lexington-Leestown Road. This is the church where the Presbyterian house of worship originally was, and instead of tearing down the Presbyterian church building, they decided to keep that building and worship in it while they built this building around, over top, and around it. They didn't put the front in until the end, and then they would take out the old building, tear it down, and put this front on. This was built by John Haley, who was a local contractor in town and one of our premier builders in the later 1800s, and also a member of this church. One of the priests of the Good Shepherd Church was a man named Thomas Major. Thomas Major had been with John Hunt Morgan's men in the Civil War, got caught up in Ohio and was put in prison. He'd been wounded and everything. He escaped too. He crawled out a tunnel, but the nuns helped him get his strength back, and he was so impressed he decided he'd become a priest. And he served here in Frankfort. On the 10th day of December, he baptized a 10-pound, 10-ounce baby who still is alive today. Former Mayor Frank Sauer, born in 1910. He was baptized by a Civil War veteran. Incredible. Right across the street is our famous singing bridge. If you listen closely in the wintertime, I've heard jingle bells. I've heard Santa Claus is coming to town. Let's see, I don't know if there's going to be a car to perform for the television viewers or not here. This originally was a covered bridge. In the first week that they put this bridge in operation years ago, when it was a wooden bridge, it fell through. Several people were killed. They repaired it, put it back together again. During the Civil War occupation, when the South was here, the Confederates, they were going to burn the bridge up. But the local people in town talked them into, well, why don't you just tear out some of the bottom of the bridge so that nobody can cross it in terms of horses or wagons and everything. But don't destroy the bridge. And they agreed to keep it. That was pretty nice of them to do that. This bridge itself is over 100 years old now. The metal grating that makes it sing, now you're going to get a chance to hear the sing. So let's listen closely now. This was installed in 1937. Doesn't that sound like Jailhouse Rock to you? I'm not sure. Across the street is the First Baptist Church. One of the early preachers at the First Baptist Church was Porter Clay. He was a brother to Henry Clay. Porter Clay had a state job. He was, I think, the auditor of public accounts. And so the folks at the church said, now look, Porter, if you're going to be a preacher, you got to, drop this other job because we need you to go out and visit the sick and take care of matters here at the church. And he said, well, I understand. He said, well, you got to make up your mind. What's it going to be? State or the church? He says, well, the state pays a whole lot better than you do. He wound up working for the state for about 14 years. And beautiful place indeed. Across the street is the Duval Building, 1888, if my eyes are working correctly today. Down in the bottom used to be two old movie theaters. And I mean old movie theaters. They were the silent films. And it's amazing what was in those films. One of the ladies, I read an account in the Frankfort State Journal about her remembrances of going to the movies there, and she said she would always, she was glad because the movies were only like 15 minutes long, because she would have to cross her legs because the rats were all running around in the building there. So that was pretty difficult for her. The building on the corner, the Mason Hogue building, was built by the grandson of a man who was the bridge builder for Stonewall Jackson during the Civil War. This guy was 60 years old. Clayton Rice Mason. And this guy was an old-timer. He could figure out how to build those bridges in a day or two, whereas most of the engineers would say either we can't do it or it's going to take at least 4 or 5 weeks to build this bridge. He could do it in a matter of minutes practically, just in days. He just had that in mind. He went on with his company later on to develop some of the subways in New York City. He worked in the city of Chicago. This was his grandson that built this building here. It's interesting to note that his company went out of business this year, 1999. It was over in Lexington, Kentucky. The Mason Hanger Company, I believe it was called. So it has just now gone out of business. Behind me, we're approaching Frankfort's first skyscraper, built in 1907. Now, back in the early days in Frankfort, Kentucky, before the McClure building was there, that was the Mansion House. The Mansion House was a very famous hotel. A lot of murders took place on this corner. Almost all of them had to do with politics. Somebody didn't like something, so they just whip out a gun. Same thing on the steps of our courthouse. A lot of times people didn't like the settlements that the judge would do. They'd just up and shoot somebody. Things are a little bit different today than they were then. This was also one of our first post offices on this corner, the side of. Now we got to make a choice, a decision. We can either end this and go back down to where we started, or if you think you got enough stamina and want to go with us the rest of the route, we can go down Ann Street and come back around Broadway the other side. And I'll tell you what I'll do. I'm going to take the TV guy and go down this way so that they'll have that as a record. And if you want to go, you're welcome to come along. It's just another 10 or 15 minutes. We'll continue to watch. Now, one of the things about these beautiful old buildings downtown is that most of us only see the front level, where the doors are, where we go inside, and we never look up to the top. And we never see the interesting architecture. For instance, 1888 Mason and Hogue building on the front of that building. And notice the architectural designing and works that's there. We had a fire in the 1970s in a very, very cold winter, and this building was almost literally destroyed. When the water from the fire trucks was placed up against the building to put it out, it froze and created like an ice crystal building there, and it saved the entire outer walls. But the interior, from the roof all the way to the basement, was completely destroyed. From what I understand, all that really is there is just the first floor and a false ceiling, and there's nothing all the way up to the roof. Now, this structure here on this corner was built by John Haley, the man who built the Good Shepherd Church we talk about. In fact, he just about built everything on this street. For those of you that remember the Capitol Theater when it was here, he built that building as well. Notice some of the names on the buildings. Musey across the street there, that used to be Musey's Restaurant. A lot of you remember that from the 60s and the 50s. Great place to eat. You notice the glass work at 239 there on Main Street. And when you get around, you can see some of the architecture at the top and some of the designs that some of these builders would go to great lengths to create, and yet are hidden today by the trees. There's some talk about removing these trees and putting in smaller trees so that you can continue to see the wonderful architecture of many of these buildings. Now, with our television camera, we want to get a shot of the W.A. Gaines building, which was established in 1868. And as you get a little closer, be sure to look where the upper level of windows is. Those faces, aren't they intriguing? The smile, or is that a smile? And some of the strange looks. Why they did that, we have no idea. And yet, many people walk up and down Main Street every day and never look up and never see some of the interesting work that's been done. For instance, this building right here, it serves several different businesses on the lower level, but the actual building starts way down there and works its way all the way up here. It actually went all the way to the corner, but they did some renovation work years ago and finished it up. This again is another one of the John Haley buildings and the way it was constructed. Up here on this corner of Lewis Street and Main is the original Farmers Bank and Capital Trust Company. It actually first started out across the street on the corner until they could get this building built. John Haley again built this building in 1849, 50, somewhere around there. It's now First Federal's Bank, as Farmers Bank has another building down the street. In this corner room at the top, that's where Irvin S. Cobb would board when he was here taking care of his story on Governor Goebel and the shooting. As I think I may have mentioned, he was in the movies with Will Rogers and wrote quite a few interesting books as well. Across the street, the parking garage, the Sullivan Square, that was where the Capitol Theater once was, that John Haley also built. That was destroyed by man back in the 70s. They created a parking lot there, and there was, I guess we didn't have a historical movement at that time that would save that building. On retrospect, we all wish we'd have been able to keep it. This building here on this corner was John Haley's office. He operated out of here with his designs and contracts and his various draftsmen and everything. Not the front part, but the back part is where he was located. Now, as we get a little closer up here, you're going to see a drugstore. In fact, you can see it as you walk along, and I think, David, for your TV viewers, you might want to cross over there so you can see the pestle and mortar at the top that they built on top of it. Most people never do see this. You almost have to get out in the street to get a good look at it. This was a pharmacy. And Mr. Averill, he wanted to be ready to serve you 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So his family lived on the second and third floors. so that if you had something wrong with you at 2 o'clock in the morning, you could come and bang and make a lot of noise, and they would come down and take care of you. They had a thriving business. It was about the only one really doing this kind of service. He was the first president of the Kentucky Pharmacy Association, and then as years would go by and he got older and his sons were not all that interested, it became just offices and a place for somebody to have a place to stay. The building on the corner over there was another one of their John Haley buildings. Now back before the 1800s, back in the early 1800s, almost every one of these corners, it was a tavern. There were all sorts of little inns and places that you could you know, have a little drink. I'm not talking about the motel type places. This is the real McCoy, where you come and sit down and get a draft and talk over business. That's what used to be on that corner originally. But then in years past, it would become other buildings as they would replace them. We're very fortunate to have the buildings we have here in the capital city. Many of the early structures were made of wood, and they all burnt to the ground. We had a lot of devastating fires, as we said. We're going to cross the street here, right against the light, and take you over to see this building here. It's called the Bentley Building today, Bentley Corner. But this used to be, in the 60s, the home of Capital Federal Savings and Loan. And years ago, I think maybe, was this where the State Bank used to be located? I'm not really sure about that story. That may be another one we have to pick up. But notice all the intricate patterns on the structure of that building there. And when you get done looking at that building, take a look over here on this corner. This is a replica of the cornerstone for the city of Frankfort. It says October 6, 1888. They had their centennial program then. That was the founding of the city of Frankfort, October 6th in 1786. This used to stand down there by the river on a pedestal, and somehow or another it disappeared. Whether it went into the river or whether somebody's got it in their house somewhere over 100 years ago, we're not sure. But Pat Layton, who was a city commissioner at the time, somehow discovered this over in one of the buildings over near the Humane Society, and they've decided to put it here, and it really serves well. This is the man who founded the town of Frankfort, General James Wilkinson, and the city, and then Hancock was the man who surveyed the property. Now remember all those faces we saw on the buildings? We saw lions, we saw strange looking men with mustaches, and take a look at all of these faces on the Masonic Temple. This building was built by one of Louisville's top architects in the early 1900s. And they had their offices for the Masonic Temple upstairs, while the downstairs was let out to businesses. And if you look closely and get a picture, you'll see gargoyles, you'll see serpents over there coming around the corner. You'll see some of those creatures that look like something out of the movie The Exorcist. It's a really interesting, fabulous construction. Look at the very top on the far right and see that lion's head. It looks similar to the one that we saw on the Buckley building back on St. Clair. Why they did this, I have no idea. That's not to say there isn't an answer somewhere. It's only to say that I haven't come across it yet. Where the State National Bank building is located, this was the original site of the Capitol Hotel. And before the Capitol Hotel, it was the Weisiger Inn. This is where Lafayette came for his big ball. This is where a lot of the big blowouts happened in our community on this corner. They built this Capitol Hotel in the 1850s. I think it destroyed, and then they rebuilt it again. John Haley again built it, and it would succumb to fire in the early 1900s. This was built back in a much more recent time. He sort of didn't take care of his kid. Albert Bacon Fall was really raised by his grandma and grandpa, Philip Slater Fall. As he would grow up into his 20s, he became a school teacher out at Bald Knob. But not being too excited about Frankfort, Kentucky, he decides he's going to go west. And he goes out to Texas and to New Mexico and becomes one of the most famous people in the state of New Mexico. Albert Bacon Fall was a congressman from New Mexico, but he really lived in Texas, and he had a lot of problems about that. That's another story. He became, during the Harding administration, the Minister of Interior. He had known Harding when they were together in the legislature, in Congress, and they became good buddies. So when Harding became President of the United States, he got his old buddy, Albert Bacon Fall, to become Minister of the Interior. Well, this, if you remember your history books, was the time of the Teapot Dome scandal out in Wyoming, oil fields. Albert Bacon Fall, born in Frankfort, Kentucky, was involved in that, and he literally took the fall. He was the first federal high-ranking officer in a presidential cabinet to be indicted, to be sentenced to a term in prison for a year, and to be fined $100,000, which was a whole lot. And he was an old man. This drug go through the courts for some 10 years during the 20s. It was always a big story, and it would always keep coming up. Of course, you know about all the other stories in the Harding administration linked to graft. Well, Albert Bacon Fall, the very first to be indicted, was from Frankfort, Kentucky, and ironically, he was the grandson of the preacher who started the First Christian Church. Our Kentucky History Center, you see here, this was the Meriwether House on the corner. And this was a big, huge hotel. And right about in the middle, where the entranceway is to the History Center, is where Paul Sawyer's family lived. And he would just walk across the street there, get on the train, take off. About where the depot was located, there used to be a log cabin, and that was the home of John Gannot. John Gannot was a Baptist preacher, and he was George Washington's chaplain during the Revolutionary War. It is believed that he baptized George Washington. Got no proof for that story. We'll tell you right up front that we don't know if that is true or not. But there is some evidence that he may have baptized him. He lived here in Frankfort, Kentucky, in that little log cabin for many years. He's buried up in the Frankfort Cemetery, and he was the one that would preach the first sermon over there at the Wilkinson cabin that we talked about in the corner of Wapping and Wilkinson Boulevard. Of course, across the street we have now the First Christian Church in their parking lot in their new building, which they just built. But some of you can remember back not so long ago when Putt's Restaurant was on the corner. Used to go in there, Carmelo Bonassi's place, and enjoy that good old food. All those wild things he had from World War II hanging around and everything. Lots of memories there. Does anybody remember what the next building was after Putt's Restaurant?
Okay, Charlie.
Okay, here we go. Charlie the old-timer, Charlie Hall, is going to rake his brain here. Try to come back. Would it help if I mentioned the name Raymond Moretti?
Moretti's Whiskey Store.
Moretti's Liquor Store, that's right.
You've ever forgotten that, Charlie?
How could you forget that? Lots of memories as we see a lot of changes take place. Parking lots here where once stood older buildings. Now we're more concerned about saving and preserving our buildings. You can get a good shot, I don't know if the sun will ruin it for you there, David, of just Broadway and the street buildings here as you look up and down the location. Also a nice looking vehicle here from a few years back as well. Now we always like to give our visitors an opportunity to ask a question or two if you have any. Don't guarantee you an answer. I will say I don't know if I don't know. Any questions?
You left my favorite building off the top. You went to the top of the hill hidden by the big tree.
Oh, the Kentucky Arsenal. That's up there, David, hidden by those trees. You can see the castle-like top to it. That's the Kentucky Arsenal built in 1850. That's the very building that John Hunt Morgan's men wanted to sack and take all the weaponry and the gunpowder out of to utilize for their purposes during the final days of the Confederacy. So we got to be sure to get that. Tom used to be the director of that Kentucky Military Museum today. Is it Mr. Bright that's running that nowadays? Bill Bright. Now we're back to the grounds of the old Capitol. Behind you there on the corner at that building that was once where all the movers and groovers did all the work. The old Capitol is where the legislators met, but this building was a restaurant, Kagan's Restaurant, and this is where they really made all their decisions. This is where they decided how they were going to vote on the bills and everything before they would get back in there. And it was quite an interesting place. That's where Goebel would go and many others and spend their times in there enjoying good meals. Well, again, that's the completion of our tour today. If you have any other questions, feel free to ask. We do appreciate you making the trip with us today. This is a program through the Frankfort, Franklin County Tourist and Convention Commission. They've provided this for the last 3 years here in the capital city. We certainly do appreciate you folks making the tour as well. Question?
Yeah, you said the Meriwether Hotel was down there on the corner?
Meriwether House?
Yeah, hotels and so forth, right there where the History Center is, right?
Right on the corner.
Right on the corner.
Now, I don't think that building, the Meriwether House, was around here in the last 40 or 50 years. I think that was another building at that time, because they would often tear them down. But you can see this level of structures here, the beauty and the care that the various business owners have taken to keep it. Look at the structure there on Completely Kentucky at the top. You can see either the building is buckling a little bit or it has some kind of a circular top that went over those. And in photographs, like for instance here, where Poor Richard's Books is, you can see the building to the left and the building to the right are very, very similar, and probably all three of those were all part of one building, and they just removed the windows there for the Poor Richard's Bookstore for whatever purpose. Any other questions? All right. Well, again, thank you all for taking the trip, and we'll see you next year.
How'd that Yankee ever get to be good?
Stole it.
He didn't make it long.
How many would you have?